The great hall of Ashwood Castle had never felt so cold. Elena Voss stood at its center, her wrists bound in silver chains that burned against her skin, while hundreds of pack members watched in silence. Above her, on a raised stone platform, stood Damian Ashwood, the Alpha King, his golden eyes hard as stone. Just 3 nights ago, those same eyes had looked at her with nothing but warmth. Now they held only judgment. "Elena Voss," Damian said, his voice carrying through the hall like thunder. "You stand accused of betraying this pack. 12 warriors are dead, because someone opened our gates to the Blackthorn clan. The evidence points to you." Elena lifted her chin, refusing to let her voice shake. "I did not do this, Damian. You know me. You have known me since we were children. Ask yourself who benefits from this lie." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Damian's jaw tightened, but he did not step down from the platform. Beside him stood his advisor, an older wolf named Edgar, who leaned close and whispered something into the king's ear. Damian's expression darkened further. "The scent trail found near the eastern gate matches yours," Damian said. "A witness saw you near the border the night of the attack. What would you have me believe, Elena? That everyone is lying except you?" "I would have you believe in the bond we share," Elena said quietly, and for a moment, something flickered across Damian's face. The mate bond between them was not something that could be faked or forged. It was a thread that connected their hearts, a thing older than any law in the kingdom. But grief has a way of drowning even the strongest truths, and Damian had buried 12 of his warriors that morning. "The council has voted," Damian said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the words, though he covered it quickly. "You are stripped of your title as beta of this pack. You are banished from Ashwood territory, effective at moonrise tonight. If you are found within our borders after this night, the punishment will be severe." Gasps spread through the hall. Even those who did not know Elena well understood the weight of what was happening. Banishment was rare, and it was almost always permanent. Elena felt her knees threaten to give out beneath her, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You are making a mistake," she said, looking directly at him. "One day you will see the truth, and I hope you can live with what you have done today." Damian did not answer. He simply nodded to the guards standing near her, and they moved forward to release her chains and escort her toward the great doors. As she passed by the crowd, she searched for a single friendly face, someone who might believe her, but most eyes turned away. Fear does that to people. It makes them silent when silence is safest. Near the back of the hall, a young wolf named Nathan Cole, one of the newer warriors in Damian's personal guard, watched Elena being led away with a troubled expression. He had trained under her for 2 years before she became beta, and everything he knew about her told him this could not be true. But he was young, and he had no proof, only a feeling in his gut that something did not add up. Elena was given until moonrise to gather her things. She returned to the small stone cottage she had shared with Damian since their mating ceremony 2 years earlier, and she moved through the rooms in a daze, touching objects that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's life. A woven blanket from her mother. A carved wooden box that held letters Damian had written her before they were mated, back when he still had to court her the old way, with words and patience rather than titles and thrones. She packed only what she could carry. A cloak, a hunting knife, a small pouch of coins. She left the letters behind, because carrying them would have been too painful, and because some small, stubborn part of her still hoped that if she left them, there would be a home to return to someday. As the sun sank low over the mountains, casting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, Elena walked to the edge of Ashwood territory, where a group of guards waited to make sure she crossed the boundary line. Among them was Damian himself, standing apart from the others, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "Why are you here?" Elena asked him quietly, as the guards kept a respectful distance. "To make sure it is done properly," Damian said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Elena studied his face for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that did not match his words, a flicker of doubt buried beneath layers of grief and anger. But doubt was not enough to stop banishment, and she knew it. "You will regret this," she said, not as a threat, but as a simple truth. "Not because I wish harm on you, Damian, but because somewhere out there, the real traitor is still walking free inside your walls, and you have just thrown away the one person who would have helped you find them." Damian's throat moved as he swallowed, but he said nothing. Elena turned from him and stepped across the boundary line, feeling the invisible pull of the pack bond stretch and strain with every step, like a rope being pulled taut. It did not break. That surprised her. Banishment was supposed to sever the pack connection entirely, but something remained, faint and thin, like a single thread refusing to snap. She did not look back. She could not afford to. If she looked back and saw him standing there, she was not sure her legs would carry her forward again. The forest beyond Ashwood territory was unfamiliar and unwelcoming. Elena had grown up within the safety of packlands her entire life, and the wilderness outside felt vast and indifferent to her presence. She walked through the night without stopping, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the only home she had ever known. By dawn, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. She found a small cave tucked into a rocky hillside and crawled inside, curling up against the cold stone. Sleep came slowly, filled with fractured images of the trial, of Damien's face, of the silver chains burning against her wrists. She woke to the sound of her own stomach turning, a wave of nausea rising up so suddenly that she barely made it outside the cave before she was sick. She knelt there in the dirt, breathing hard, confused by the sudden illness. She had not eaten anything unusual. She had not been near anything poisonous. As the nausea passed, she sat back against a tree and pressed a hand to her stomach, and a strange awareness bloomed within her, something she could not yet name but somehow already understood. She stayed still for a long moment, listening to her own body in a way she never had before. Wolves had heightened senses, senses that extended beyond sight and smell into something deeper, something that could detect life in ways humans could not. And what Elena sensed now, faint but unmistakable, was not one heartbeat beneath her own, but two. Her hand trembled against her stomach. She was carrying children, Damien's children, and in the same terrible morning that she realized this, she understood the impossible position she had been placed in. She was alone, banished, hunted, and pregnant with the heirs to the very throne that had just cast her out. For a long while, she simply sat there, unable to move, caught between fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope. If Damien knew, would it change anything? Would he believe her then? Or would he see the pregnancy as one more lie, one more manipulation from a woman he now believed to be his enemy? She thought of Lyra, Damien's cousin, who had always watched Elena with something sharp behind her polite smiles. She thought of how quickly the evidence against her had appeared, how convenient the timing had been, how the witness who claimed to see her near the border had never been named publicly. None of it made sense if Elena was truly guilty. All of it made sense if someone else wanted her gone. But suspicion was not proof, and she had no way to gather proof from outside the very walls that had exiled her. She was a banished woman, alone in unfamiliar territory, with two lives growing inside her that she had to protect above everything else. She rose to her feet slowly, wiping the dust from her cloak, and made a decision. She would not waste her exile in grief. She would survive. She would find somewhere safe to have her children, and she would raise them far from the politics and danger that had destroyed her life in a single terrible night. Someday, perhaps, the truth would come to light on its own. Until then, she had to think only of the two small heartbeats depending on her. She traveled for 3 more days, moving carefully through unfamiliar forests, avoiding the main roads where bounty hunters might be watching for banished wolves, seeking to return to their old territories. She had heard stories of what happened to exiles who tried to sneak back, and she had no intention of becoming one of those stories. On the 4th day, exhausted and low on food, she came across a narrow trail that wound up into the hills, marked with small carved symbols on the trees that she did not recognize. Something about the markings felt intentional, like a message meant for those who knew how to read it. Wolves who had nowhere else to go sometimes followed such trails, hoping they led somewhere safe. She followed it. The trail wound higher into rocky terrain, past a waterfall that fed into a clear stream, until it opened into a wide valley tucked between 2 mountains, hidden from view unless one already knew it existed. Smoke rose from a cluster of wooden buildings nestled against the mountainside, and the scent of cooking food drifted toward her on the wind, making her stomach ache with hunger. A woman stepped out from between 2 trees before Elena reached the edge of the settlement, moving with the quiet grace of someone well accustomed to guarding hidden places. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back from a weathered but kind face. "You are far from any packlands," the woman said, studying Elena carefully, "and you carry the scent of exile on you." Elena straightened her shoulders, too tired to hide the truth even if she wanted to. "I was banished 4 days ago. I have nowhere else to go." The woman's eyes moved briefly to Elena's stomach, and something in her expression softened, as though she understood things Elena had not yet spoken aloud. "I am Margaret," she said. "This is a sanctuary for those who have nowhere else. We do not ask questions about the past here, only about what help is needed now. Come. You look like you have not eaten in days, and you are not walking for only one life anymore." Elena's breath caught. "How did you know?" "I have delivered enough children in my years to recognize the signs," Margaret said gently, "and unless I am mistaken, which is rare, you are carrying more than one." Tears rose unexpectedly in Elena's eyes, the first she had allowed herself since the trial. Margaret placed a steady hand on her shoulder and guided her toward the settlement, and for the first time since the silver chains had been locked around her wrists, Elena allowed herself to believe that survival was possible. Behind her, far beyond the mountains, in the great hall of Ashwood Castle, Damien Ashwang sat alone on his throne, long after the last of his advisors had gone to bed. He stared at the empty space where Elena used to stand beside him during council meetings, and for reasons he could not explain, sleep would not come to him that night, nor for many nights after. Something in his chest ached in a way that grief for his fallen warriors did not fully explain, a hollow feeling that whispered, quietly but persistently, that he had made a terrible mistake. He did not yet know how right that feeling was, nor how far its consequences would reach. But somewhere deep within him, beneath the anger and the grief, the truth was already beginning to stir, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. Elena spent her first week at the sanctuary simply learning how to breathe again. Margaret gave her a small wooden room at the edge of the settlement, close enough to the main lodge for safety but far enough to offer privacy. The room held a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single window that looked out over the valley, and to Elena, after 4 days of sleeping on cold ground, it felt like the most luxurious place in the world. The sanctuary was home to nearly 30 wolves, each carrying a story they rarely spoke of. Some had been cast out for crimes they insisted they had not committed. Others had fled arranged matings, or packs torn apart by war, or simply families that no longer wanted them. Margaret ran the settlement with quiet authority, and though she was not an alpha in title, everyone deferred to her judgment as though she were. "We do not ask where you come from," Margaret told Elena on her second day, as she showed her around the small gardens where they grew vegetables to supplement what the hunters brought in. "But if you ever wish to speak of it, I will listen without judgment." Elena found herself grateful for the offer, but unable to accept it, not yet. The wound was too fresh, and speaking of Damien's face, as he pronounced her banishment, still felt like pressing on a bruise that had not begun to heal. Instead, she threw herself into helping with the sanctuary's daily work, tending the gardens, mending clothing, and learning the rhythms of a community built entirely on second chances. As the weeks passed, her body began to change in ways that made the reality of her situation impossible to ignore. Her stomach rounded gently, and Margaret, true to her word, checked on her regularly, pressing gentle hands against her belly and nodding with quiet satisfaction. "Strong heartbeats," Margaret said one afternoon, as Elena lay resting in the small infirmary building. "Both of them. You carry twins, and unless my years of experience fail me, they carry alpha blood. I can feel it even now, faint as it is." Elena's hand rested over her stomach. "Their father is an alpha king," she admitted quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she did not press further, simply nodding, as though the pieces of a puzzle had clicked into place. "Then you carry heirs to a throne," she said. "That is a heavy thing to carry alongside 2 children." "I do not want a throne," Elena said, her voice firm. "I only want them to be safe. Whatever happens between their father and me, I need them to grow up somewhere. No one can use them as a weapon in someone else's war." Margaret studied her for a long moment, before nodding again. "Then we will keep that safety for as long as we are able. You are welcome here for as long as you need." Elena spent her evenings sitting by the window in her small room, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and slowly, she allowed herself to imagine a future. Not the future she had once believed was hers, filled with council meetings and a throne beside Damien, but a smaller, quieter future, one where her children grew up surrounded by kindness rather than politics. But peace, she would soon learn, was a fragile thing, in a world still shadowed by the war between Ashwood and Blackthorn. 3 months into her stay at the sanctuary, a scout named Oliver Finch returned from a routine patrol with troubling news. He was a lean, quiet young man who rarely spoke unless necessary, but that evening he gathered the sanctuary's senior members together, including Elena, with visible urgency in his expression. "There are hunters moving through the lower valley," Oliver said. "Not Blackthorn scouts. These carry Ashwood colors. They are searching the region, moving from settlement to settlement, asking about a banished woman." Elena's stomach tightened, and instinctively her hand moved to protect the curve of her belly, though there was no immediate danger in the room. "Are they searching for me specifically?" "They did not give a name," Oliver said, "but the description matches. Dark hair, gray eyes, believed to be traveling alone. They say the king himself ordered the search." A wave of confusion passed through Elena. If Damien believed her guilty, why would he send hunters searching for her, rather than simply letting her exile stand? Unless something had changed, unless doubt had finally taken root in him, the way it had begun to take root in her the moment she felt her children's heartbeats for the first time. "What do the hunters intend if they find her?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp with protective concern. "Unclear," Oliver admitted. "Some say they are meant to bring her back for further questioning. Others say the king wishes to speak with her personally. No one seems entirely certain of the true purpose." Elena's mind raced through the possibilities. If she was captured and brought back only to face further punishment, her children would be in danger the moment anyone in Ashwood discovered she was pregnant. But if Damien himself wished to speak with her, perhaps something had shifted. Perhaps the truth was finally beginning to surface. She could not risk her children's safety on uncertainty. "I will need to be more careful," Elena said finally. "If the hunters come near this valley, I cannot let them see me." Margaret nodded firmly. "We will keep you hidden. This sanctuary has protected many people from many dangers over the years. You are not the first, and you will not be the last." For the following weeks, Elena stayed close to the sanctuary buildings, avoiding the outer trails where hunters might pass. She learned to recognize the sound of unfamiliar footsteps, the particular way strangers moved through unfamiliar terrain, compared to those who called the valley home. The sanctuary's careful system of lookouts and warning signals became a comfort to her, even as the fear of discovery lingered constantly at the edges of her thoughts. One evening, as autumn began to color the leaves along the mountainside, Elena sat in the garden with a young woman named Charlotte, another resident of the sanctuary, who had become something of a friend during Elena's months there. Charlotte had fled an arranged mating 2 years earlier, and had found in the sanctuary the same quiet refuge Elena now depended on. "Do you ever think about going back?" Charlotte asked, watching Elena's hands move absently over the curve of her stomach. "If the truth came out, I mean. If everyone learned you were innocent." Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I think about it more than I would like to admit," she said. "Not because I want the throne, or the title, or any of what I lost. But because somewhere in that castle, there is a man who I once believed knew my heart completely, and I want to know if that was ever really true, or if it broke the moment things became difficult." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "And if he came looking for you? If he found you here, carrying his children?" Elena's throat tightened at the thought, an image rising unbidden of Damien's face, of the golden eyes that had once looked at her with such warmth. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. "I have imagined 100 versions of that moment, and in none of them am I certain how I would feel." As the days grew shorter and colder, Elena's pregnancy advanced steadily, and Margaret began preparing more seriously for the birth, gathering herbs and supplies, teaching Elena breathing techniques that would help when the time came. The sanctuary's small community rallied around her in quiet, practical ways, bringing extra blankets, offering to take on her share of daily chores as her body grew heavier and more tired. It was during this time that Elena first noticed something strange happening within her. The children moving inside her did not feel like ordinary infants. Their presence carried a weight, a power that pulsed faintly through the mate bond that still connected her, however thinly, to Damien and to the pack she had left behind. Margaret noticed it too, during her regular examinations, a faint golden light that seemed to shimmer beneath Elena's skin when the twins moved. "I have delivered many children in my years," Margaret said one evening, her expression thoughtful, "but I have never seen anything quite like this. Whatever bloodline runs through these children, it is strong. Stronger, perhaps, than even their father realizes." Elena absorbed this information with a growing sense of both wonder and worry. If her children carried such powerful bloodlines, it would make them targets the moment their existence became known, not only to whoever had truly betrayed the pack, but to any enemy who understood the value of alpha heirs. She resolved more firmly than ever to keep their existence secret for as long as possible, protecting them within the quiet walls of the sanctuary until they were strong enough, and she was prepared enough, to face whatever the wider world might bring. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Elena, the search for her had become more than a simple mission of retrieval. Within the walls of Ashwood Castle, cracks were beginning to form in the story that had led to her banishment, cracks that would soon widen into a truth no one had expected, and that would change everything for the woman hiding in the mountains with 2 small heartbeats growing steadily beneath her own. Winter arrived early in the mountains that year, wrapping the sanctuary valley in a thick blanket of snow that made travel nearly impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. Elena found a strange comfort in the isolation. The heavy snowfall meant fewer hunters passing through the lower valleys, fewer chances of discovery, and more quiet days spent preparing for the arrival of her children. She had grown large with the pregnancy now, her steps slower and more careful, and Margaret rarely let her stray far from the main lodge. The sanctuary's healer had set up a small room specifically for the birth, lined with warm furs, and stocked with the herbs and supplies she would need. Elena spent her days there now, resting, listening to the soft crackle of the fire, and feeling the increasingly strong movements of the twins within her. "They are eager to meet the world," Margaret said one afternoon, pressing her palm gently against Elena's stomach and smiling at the enthusiastic response beneath her hand. "Strong ones, these two. You should be proud." Elena managed a small smile, though worry never fully left her these days. She thought often of Damien, wondering if he ever sensed anything through the thin thread that still connected them, wondering if he lay awake at night the way she sometimes did, caught in memories neither of them could fully escape. She did not know that, at that very moment, in the great hall of Ashwood Castle, a young warrior named Nathan Cole was standing before the king with information that would begin to unravel everything. "My king," Nathan said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness at addressing Damien directly. "I have spent months looking into the events of that night, the night of the Blackthorn raid. Something does not sit right with me, and I believe you should hear what I have found." Damien, seated at the head of a long table in his private study, set down the papers he had been reviewing and gave the young warrior his full attention. In the months since Elena's banishment, Damien had become a different kind of leader, more guarded, more prone to long silences, and his advisors had noticed the change with growing concern. "Speak," Damien said simply. Nathan laid out what he had discovered, carefully and methodically. The witness who had claimed to see Elena near the eastern gate on the night of the raid had never been publicly named, and when Nathan finally tracked down the guard who first reported the sighting, the man admitted under careful questioning that he had never actually seen Elena himself. He had simply repeated what he had been told to say by a senior council member. "Which council member?" Damien asked, his voice low and dangerous. Nathan hesitated only briefly before answering. "Edgar, my king, your advisor." The room fell silent. Edgar had been Damien's most trusted advisor since childhood, a man who had guided him through every major decision since he first took the throne. The accusation was serious, almost unthinkable, and Damien's expression darkened with a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. "You are certain of this?" Damien asked. "I have 3 separate accounts confirming it," Nathan said. "And there is more. The scent trail that was found near the gate, the one that supposedly matched Elena's, was tested only once, by a single tracker who reported directly to Edgar. No second confirmation was ever sought, which goes against standard procedure for accusations of this severity." Damien sat back in his chair, his mind racing through the events of that terrible night months ago. He had been so consumed by grief over the fallen warriors, so desperate for someone to hold accountable, that he had accepted the evidence without the careful scrutiny he would normally apply to matters of such importance. The realization settled over him like a physical weight. "Continue the investigation," Damien said finally, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "Quietly. I want to know everything before I act. And Nathan, I want you to lead this personally. Report only to me." Nathan bowed and left the room, and Damien sat alone in the growing darkness of his study, staring at nothing in particular, his thoughts consumed by a single unbearable possibility. If Elena had been innocent, if he had banished the woman he loved based on lies constructed by someone he trusted completely, then the ache that had lived in his chest for months finally made a terrible kind of sense. It was not simply grief or guilt, it was the mate bond itself, straining against a separation that should never have happened. He thought of the way Elena had looked at him during the trial, not with anger, but with a kind of sorrowful understanding, as though she had known even then that he was making a mistake, but had chosen to let him make it, rather than fight against a decision he was not yet ready to hear challenged. The memory haunted him now, in a way it had not before. Over the following weeks, Nathan's investigation expanded carefully and quietly, gathering testimony from guards, trackers, and council members who had been present during the events surrounding the raid and the trial. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that pointed not toward Elena's guilt, but toward a carefully constructed plan, designed to remove her from the pack entirely. Damien, meanwhile, found himself increasingly unable to focus on his duties as king. He moved through council meetings and diplomatic negotiations with a kind of hollow efficiency, his mind constantly drifting back to the investigation, to Elena, to the growing certainty that he had failed the one person who had always been honest with him. Edgar, for his part, seemed to sense the shifting winds within the castle, growing more watchful and careful in his interactions with Damien, though he gave no outward sign of guilt. He continued to advise the king on matters of state, offering counsel with the same calm confidence he always had, and Damien found it increasingly difficult to look at him without wondering how much of their years together had been built on manipulation rather than genuine loyalty. One evening, as Nathan reported his latest findings, a new name entered the investigation, one that sent a chill through Damien's chest. "There is a connection to Lady Lyra," Nathan said carefully. "One of the trackers who provided false testimony has been seen meeting with her privately, on multiple occasions, both before and after the trial. I have not yet confirmed the nature of these meetings, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. Damien's cousin Lyra had always been ambitious, a fact well known throughout the pack, though Damien had never seriously considered her capable of the kind of calculated betrayal Nathan's investigation was beginning to suggest. She stood next in line for succession, should something happen to Damien and any heirs he might have had, a position that had always seemed more theoretical than practical, given Damien's mating to Elena and the assumption that children would eventually follow. Unless, Damien realized with growing horror, someone had wanted to ensure that assumption never came true. "Find out everything," Damien said, his voice hard. "I want proof, not speculation. If my cousin is involved in what happened to Elena, I need certainty before I act, because if I am wrong about this too, I do not know if I can survive making another mistake of this magnitude." Nathan nodded and continued his careful work, and as winter deepened its grip on the kingdom, the investigation crept closer to a truth that would soon force Damien to confront not only the depth of his own failure, but the reality of a betrayal within his own family that ran far deeper than he had ever imagined. Far away in the mountain sanctuary, unaware of the storm building on her behalf within the walls of Ashwood Castle, Elena felt the first true pains of labor begin on a cold morning in early winter, 3 weeks earlier than Margaret had predicted. The sanctuary moved into careful, practiced motion around her, warm water heated, clean cloths gathered, Margaret's steady hands guiding her through the long and difficult hours that followed. Through it all, Elena thought not of Damien, nor of the throne she had left behind, but only of the 2 small lives, about to enter a world that had already proven itself capable of both great cruelty and, she hoped desperately, great kindness in equal measure. The hours passed slowly and painfully, but Elena was not alone. Margaret stayed by her side through every moment, her calm voice a steady anchor amid the waves of pain, while Charlotte and 2 other women from the sanctuary moved quietly around the room, bringing warm water and fresh cloths, keeping the fire burning strong against the cold outside. When the first child finally arrived, a small but strong boy with a shock of dark hair, the room filled with a quiet kind of joy that Elena had not expected to feel so completely, even in the middle of exhaustion and pain. Margaret placed him gently on her chest, and Elena felt the warmth of him against her skin, felt the tiny heartbeat she had sensed for so many months now finally separate from her own, and beat independently in the world. "One more to go," Margaret said gently, though her eyes carried a flicker of concern that Elena, in her exhaustion, did not fully register. The second child arrived nearly an hour later, a girl, smaller than her brother, but with lungs just as strong, her cry filling the small room with a sound that made everyone present smile, despite the long hours of effort behind them. Elena held both children close, one in each arm, and felt something shift permanently within her, a fierce and unshakable determination to protect these two small lives, no matter what the world outside the sanctuary might demand of her. "They are beautiful," Charlotte whispered, kneeling beside the bed to get a closer look at the twins. "Have you thought of names?" Elena looked down at her son first, studying the shape of his face, the faint dusting of dark hair, and found herself thinking of her own father, a man who had died when she was young, but whose memory she had always carried with quiet fondness. "Thomas," she said softly, testing the name aloud. "His name is Thomas." She turned to her daughter next, smaller and more delicate in appearance, but with a grip on Elena's finger that suggested considerable strength beneath the fragility. "And her name is Rosalind," Elena said, "after Damien's mother, who was kind to me before I ever knew what kindness from that family would come to mean." Margaret smiled as she cleaned up the last of the birthing supplies, her expression thoughtful as she watched the newborn twins settle against their mother. "Strong names for strong children," she said, "and they will need to be strong, given what runs through their blood." That night, as Elena finally drifted into exhausted sleep, with Thomas and Rosalind resting beside her, Margaret stepped outside, into the cold winter air, and looked up at the star-filled sky above the sanctuary valley. She had delivered many children over her long years of service to the hidden community, but never had she felt such a powerful presence in newborns as she had that day. The golden shimmer beneath Elena's skin during the pregnancy had transferred, faint but unmistakable, into both twins, a sign of alpha bloodline stronger than anything Margaret had witnessed in her lifetime. She said nothing of this to Elena that night, not wanting to add worry to a mother already exhausted from labor, but she resolved to keep an even closer watch over the sanctuary's defenses in the weeks and months ahead. Children carrying such power, born to a woman banished under suspicious circumstances from one of the most powerful packs in the region, would eventually attract attention, whether Elena wished it or not. The weeks that followed brought Elena into a new rhythm of life, one built entirely around the needs of her children. She learned quickly the particular cries that meant hunger, the ones that meant discomfort, and the rare, precious moments when both twins slept peacefully at the same time, allowing her a few stolen minutes of rest. The sanctuary community rallied around her with a warmth that reminded Elena, again and again, that family could be built from more than blood and titles. Thomas grew quickly, developing an early curiosity about the world around him that kept Elena constantly alert, while Rosalind proved to have a quieter, more watchful temperament, her sharp eyes seeming to take in everything around her with unusual attentiveness for an infant so young. Margaret often remarked that Rosalind watched people the way an experienced tracker studied the forest, searching for patterns others might miss. As spring began to melt the heavy winter snow from the mountain passes, Oliver Finch returned from another patrol, with news that sent a ripple of concern through the sanctuary once more. The Ashwood hunters who had been searching the region months earlier had not given up their efforts, and now, more troublingly, scouts bearing the markings of the Blackthorn clan had also been spotted moving through the lower valleys, closer to the sanctuary than they had ever come before. "They may simply be scouting the region for other reasons," Oliver said, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe his own reassurance. "But we should not assume we are safe, simply because we have remained hidden until now." Margaret called a meeting of the sanctuary's senior members that evening, and Elena sat quietly through the discussion, Thomas and Rosalind sleeping peacefully in a woven basket beside her chair, unaware of the danger their existence represented to those who might wish to use them as weapons in a war they had been born into without ever asking for it. We will strengthen our watch positions, Margaret decided finally. And Elena, I think it is time we discuss what you wish to do, now that the twins have arrived safely. Do you intend to stay here indefinitely, or is there a different path you are considering? Elena looked down at her sleeping children, their small chests rising and falling in peaceful unison, and felt the weight of the question settle heavily upon her. She had built a fragile peace here in the mountains, but peace built on hiding could not last forever. Not with scouts from two powerful packs both circling ever closer to the valley that had become her refuge. I do not know yet, Elena admitted honestly, but I know that I cannot let my children grow up always looking over their shoulders, always afraid of being found. At some point, the truth of what happened to me will need to come to light, whether I seek it out myself or whether it finds its way to me first. She did not yet know how close that reckoning truly was, nor how much had already changed within the walls of Ashwood Castle since the night of her banishment. But as she looked down at Thomas and Rosalind, sleeping safely for now within the sanctuary's protective embrace, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her heart. Whatever came next, she would face it not as the frightened, banished woman who had fled into the wilderness months earlier, but as a mother determined to secure a future worthy of the children she had carried through exile and into the world. Inside Ashwood Castle, the investigation Nathan Cole had been quietly conducting for months finally reached a turning point. He arrived at Damien's private study late one evening, his expression a careful mixture of urgency and restraint, carrying with him a leather folder that contained the culmination of nearly a year of careful, dangerous work. "My king," Nathan said, closing the door firmly behind him before speaking further. "I have the proof you asked for, all of it." Damien set aside the papers he had been reviewing and gestured for Nathan to sit, though the young warrior remained standing, too tense with the weight of what he carried to settle into stillness. "The tracker who tested the scent trail near the eastern gate has confessed," Nathan began. Under careful and private questioning, he admitted that he never actually found a match to Elena's scent that night. He was paid, quite generously, to falsify the report. "The payment came through an intermediary, but I traced the funds back to an account controlled by Lady Lyra." Damien's hands tightened into fists on the surface of his desk, though he said nothing, allowing Nathan to continue. "The witness who claimed to see Elena near the border was similarly compensated," Nathan went on. "He has also confessed, though reluctantly, and only after being shown evidence that made further denial impossible. And Edgar," Nathan hesitated slightly before continuing. "Edgar coordinated the entire effort. He arranged the payments, guided the witnesses on what to say, and ensured that the evidence presented at trial would appear conclusive enough to prevent any serious challenge." "Why?" Damien's voice was low, almost a growl, though the question was not directed entirely at Nathan. "Why would Edgar do this? He has served this family for decades." Nathan opened the leather folder and withdrew a final document, sliding it across the desk toward Damien. "This is a letter, recovered from Edgar's private quarters, written in his own hand but never sent. It appears to be a draft of correspondence intended for Lady Lyra, discussing the arrangement between them. Edgar believed that with Elena removed and no immediate heir threatening Lyra's position in the line of succession, Lyra would eventually take the throne through political marriage or through your own eventual removal, and he would be rewarded for his role in making that possible." Damien read the letter slowly, his expression growing darker with every line. The document described, in careful and calculated language, a plan that had been set in motion long before the Blackthorn raid itself, a plan that suggested the raid may not have been a simple act of enemy aggression, but something orchestrated, or at least allowed to happen, in order to create the conditions necessary for Elena's downfall. "Are you suggesting," Damien said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet, "that the raid itself, the deaths of 12 of my warriors, was part of this plan?" "I cannot yet confirm that with certainty," Nathan admitted, "but the timing is deeply suspicious. Records show that our Eastern Gate patrol was reduced that particular night, on orders that came through Edgar's office, citing a need to redirect resources to a supposed threat elsewhere that was never actually confirmed. If the gate had been properly guarded, the raid may never have succeeded as it did." The full weight of what Nathan was describing settled over Damien like a physical blow. Not only had he banished an innocent woman, the mother of children he had not even known existed, but the very tragedy that had prompted her banishment may itself have been engineered by people he had trusted completely. all in service of ambitions he had never suspected existed within his own family and closest advisor. "Where is Edgar now?" Damien asked, rising from his chair. "In his quarters, my king. He does not yet know the extent of what we have uncovered." "And Lyra?" "Also within the castle, attending to her usual duties, unaware that her involvement has been discovered." Damien stood in silence for a long moment, his mind racing through the implications of everything Nathan had just revealed. Every instinct within him demanded immediate confrontation, immediate justice for the betrayal that had cost him not only Elena, but nearly a year of his life spent in grief and misguided anger. But he forced himself to think carefully, remembering the mistake he had made once already, by acting too quickly, without sufficient care. "We will not act tonight," Damien said finally. "I want every piece of evidence secured beyond any possibility of tampering or destruction. I want witnesses prepared to testify openly, not just under private questioning. When I confront Edgar and my cousin, I want the truth to be so complete and so undeniable that no council member, no advisor, no member of this pack can question it. Elena's trial was rushed, and rushed judgment is precisely what led us to this catastrophe. I will not make that same error twice." Nathan nodded, understanding the wisdom in the king's caution, even as he could see the barely contained fury simmering beneath Damien's controlled exterior. "I will have everything prepared within the week," he said. "The witnesses are frightened, but they understand now that continued silence carries its own dangers." As Nathan left the study, Damien remained alone with his thoughts, staring at the letter Edgar had written but never sent. He thought of Elena's face during the trial, the sorrowful understanding in her eyes as she told him he would regret what he was doing. She had known, even then, that something was deeply wrong, and she had tried to warn him, only to watch him choose fear and grief over trust in the bond they shared. He thought too of the strange ache that had lived in his chest for months, the sense that something essential had been severed, but not entirely broken. He had assumed it was simply grief or guilt, but now, sitting alone with the truth beginning to unfold before him, he allowed himself to wonder if it was something more. The mate bond was not something easily explained through logic, but every wolf understood its power, understood that it connected two souls in ways that transcended physical distance. If Elena was truly innocent, and if the bond between them remained even partially intact despite the banishment, then somewhere out in the world, she was alive, and some part of him had known it all along, even as his conscious mind convinced itself otherwise. Over the following days, Damien moved through his royal duties with a grim determination that his advisors noticed but did not fully understand. He met privately, with trusted council members, carefully rebuilding the case against Edgar and Lyra, with an eye toward absolute certainty rather than hasty judgment. He interviewed witnesses himself, listened to their accounts with careful attention, and cross-referenced every piece of evidence Nathan had gathered against records from the night of the raid. The picture that emerged was damning beyond question. Edgar had indeed orchestrated the reduction of the Eastern Gate Patrol, creating the opportunity for the Blackthorn raid to succeed with minimal resistance. In the aftermath, he had moved quickly to construct a narrative that placed blame on Elena, using the chaos and grief of the moment to ensure the pack accepted the accusation, without the careful scrutiny it deserved. Lyra's involvement, while slightly less direct, was unmistakable in the financial records Nathan had uncovered, payments flowing from her personal accounts to the witnesses and trackers who had provided false testimony. By the end of the week, Damien had assembled enough evidence to convene a formal council session, one that would expose the truth publicly and begin the process of correcting the terrible wrong that had been done to Elena. But even as he prepared for this confrontation, a new and more urgent question began to consume his thoughts. Elena had been gone for nearly a year now. She could be anywhere, and after everything she had endured, he had no guarantee that she would want to be found, even if he could prove her innocence beyond any doubt. The thought of facing her again, of trying to explain the depth of his failure, filled him with a fear more profound than anything he had experienced during the confrontation he was preparing to have with Edgar and Lyra. But fear, he reminded himself, was precisely what had led him to banish her in the first place. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of a threat he could not immediately identify. Fear that had made him choose the easy comfort of a scapegoat over the difficult work of seeking truth. He would not let fear guide his choices again. Whatever it took, however long the search required, he resolved that he would find her, and he would spend the rest of his life proving that he was worthy of the trust she had once placed in him. Trust he had broken so completely, on a single terrible night, nearly a year ago. The council session Damien convened took place on a gray morning, beneath heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the tension gathering within the great hall. Every senior member of the Ashwood pack had been summoned, along with witnesses Nathan had carefully prepared over the preceding days. Edgar and Lyra arrived separately, neither aware of what awaited them, though Damien noticed the flicker of unease that crossed Edgar's face when he saw the unusually large gathering assembled in the hall. Damien stood at the same platform where, nearly a year earlier, he had pronounced Elena's banishment. The irony of the location was not lost on him, and he had chosen it deliberately, wanting the same walls that had witnessed his terrible mistake to witness its correction. "I have called this council together," Damien began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "to address a grave injustice committed within these walls. Nearly a year ago, I banished Elena Voss, my mate and beta of this pack, on charges of treason. I did so based on evidence that I now know to be entirely false." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, and Damien saw Edgar's expression shift from unease to something sharper, more calculating, as though he were rapidly reassessing the situation and searching for a path forward. "The witness who claimed to see Elena near the eastern gate has confessed that he was paid to lie," Damien continued. "The tracker who matched her scent to the trail found that night has confessed the same. Both men will testify before this council today, and both have named the individual who arranged their false testimony and paid for their silence." Damien's eyes moved deliberately to Edgar, and the older advisor's composure finally cracked, a flash of genuine fear crossing his weathered face before he could suppress it. "Bring forward the witnesses," Damien commanded, and Nathan stepped forward, guiding two nervous men to stand before the council. Both, under Damien's direct and unflinching gaze, repeated their confessions publicly, describing in detail how Edgar had approached them separately in the days following the Blackthorn raid, offering payment in exchange for testimony that would implicate Elena. The hall erupted into astonished whispers, and Edgar, recognizing that denial was no longer a viable option, straightened his posture and attempted a different approach entirely. "My king," Edgar said, his voice carrying a note of practiced sincerity, "I acted only in the interest of this pack. The threat posed by continued instability, by uncertainty over succession, required decisive action. I regret the methods, but I do not regret protecting the future of this kingdom." "You regret nothing," Damien said coldly, "except being discovered. 12 warriors died that night, Edgar. Did you know the Eastern Gate Patrol had been reduced on your orders before that raid occurred? Did you understand that your scheme against Elena required a tragedy significant enough to distract this pack from careful scrutiny?" The hall fell utterly silent. Edgar's carefully constructed composure finally shattered entirely, and in the desperate silence that followed, his eyes darted briefly toward Lyra, standing near the edge of the gathered council members, her face pale, but otherwise controlled. "I did what was necessary," Edgar said, his voice rising with something between defiance and panic. "The pack needed strong leadership, not divided loyalty between a king and a mate whose bloodline offered nothing of value to our future. And Lyra offered more value, I suppose," Damien said, his voice hard as stone. "Enough value that you were willing to sacrifice 12 lives and destroy an innocent woman to secure her position." All eyes in the hall turned toward Lyra, and for a long moment, she said nothing, her expression caught between calculation and the dawning realization that her careful ambitions had finally been exposed beyond any possibility of denial. "I never asked him to arrange a raid," Lyra said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Whatever Edgar chose to orchestrate on his own initiative is not my responsibility." "The financial records suggest otherwise," Nathan said quietly, stepping forward with additional documents. "Payments to the witnesses came directly from accounts under your control, Lady Lyra. Edgar may have orchestrated the plan, but you funded its execution." Lyra's composure finally broke entirely, and in the tense silence that followed, she made a decision that would confirm every suspicion the council held. She turned suddenly and moved toward the great doors at the rear of the hall, clearly intending to flee before the situation could deteriorate further, but Damien's guards, anticipating exactly this possibility, moved swiftly to block her path. "There is nowhere to run, Lyra," Damien said, his voice heavy with a grief that had nothing to do with the 12 fallen warriors, and everything to do with the family loyalty he had once believed unshakable. "You are my cousin. I trusted you. And you allowed an innocent woman to be destroyed, along with 12 loyal warriors, all for the sake of ambition." Lyra's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from her posture, as she recognized the futility of further denial or escape. "I only wanted what I believed I deserved," she said quietly, though the words offered no comfort to anyone in the hall, least of all to Damien. The council's judgment, once the full truth had been laid bare, came swiftly and without mercy. Edgar and Lyra were both stripped of their titles and positions within the pack, and after careful deliberation, the council determined that both would face the same fate they had orchestrated for Elena: banishment from Ashwood territory, though under considerably closer guard to prevent any further scheming from beyond the borders. As guards led Edgar and Lyra from the hall, Damien remained standing on the platform, watching them go with an expression that carried more sorrow than triumph. Justice had been served, but it had come too late to undo the damage already inflicted, too late to erase the months Elena had spent alone in exile, carrying and raising children he had not even known existed. "My king," Nathan said quietly, approaching the platform once the hall had begun to empty. "What happens now?" Damien looked out over the emptying hall, his mind already moving past the satisfaction of justice served, and toward the far more difficult task that remained before him. "Now," he said, "I find her. I do not care how long it takes, or how far I must travel, or what obstacles stand in my way. I banish the woman I love based on lies, and I intend to spend whatever time is required to find her, and beg for the chance to prove that I am worthy of forgiveness, if such a thing is even possible after everything I have done." "And if she does not wish to be found?" Nathan asked carefully. "After everything she has endured, she may have built a life far from Ashwood, a life she has no wish to leave." Damien considered this possibility with the seriousness it deserved. "Then I will respect her choice," he said finally. "But I will not let her live the rest of her life, believing that I never sought the truth, that I simply accepted her banishment and moved forward without ever questioning what I had done. She deserves to know the truth has come to light, whatever she decides to do with that knowledge." Within days, Damien had assembled a small group of trusted warriors, including Nathan, to begin the search for Elena. He knew it would not be easy. Nearly a year had passed since her banishment, and she could have traveled far beyond the regions immediately surrounding Ashwood territory. But he also knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic, that the thin thread of the mate bond still connecting them would guide him, however faintly, toward wherever she had made her new home. As his search party prepared to depart from the castle, Damien paused at the boundary line where he had last seen Elena, the same spot where he had watched her cross into exile, with words of warning he had refused to fully hear. He remembered her final words to him, her certainty that he would regret his decision, and he understood now, with painful clarity, just how right she had been. "I am coming, Elena," he said quietly to the empty air, as though the words themselves might somehow reach across whatever distance separated them. "Wherever you are, whatever you have built without me, I am coming to make this right." The search proved far more difficult than Damien had anticipated. He and his small group of warriors traveled through territories bordering Ashwood lands, questioning travelers, checking with allied packs, and following every rumor of a banished woman traveling with children. But the trail, cold after nearly a year, offered little in the way of solid leads. Weeks passed, then a full month, and Damien's frustration grew alongside his determination, though he refused to consider abandoning the search. "We should try the northern territories," Nathan suggested one evening, as the group made camp beside a river swollen with spring runoff. "There are rumors of hidden settlements in the mountains there, places that shelter those with nowhere else to go. If Elena was seeking safety, such a place would offer exactly what she needed." Damien considered this. He had heard whispers of such settlements before, sanctuaries maintained by those who had once been outcasts themselves, hidden carefully enough that most packs had given up trying to locate them, assuming they were more legend than reality. But desperation had a way of making even legends worth pursuing. "We will try the northern route," Damien agreed, "but carefully. If such places exist, They exist because they value secrecy above all else. If we approach carelessly, we may frighten away the very people who could help us, or worse, put innocent people at risk if word spreads that Ashwood forces are moving through the region. The journey north proved treacherous, winding through mountain passes still thick with the last remnants of winter snow, and more than once the group found themselves navigating terrain that pushed even their considerable endurance to its limits. Damien drove himself harder than any of his companions, sleeping little, pressing forward, even when exhaustion weighed heavily on his warriors, driven by a growing certainty that they were moving in the right direction. He felt it most strongly at night, when the world grew quiet and his thoughts had nowhere to go but toward Elena. The thin thread of the mate bond, which had remained a faint and distant sensation for so many months, seemed to grow slightly stronger with each mile they traveled north, as though proximity itself was strengthening a connection that distance had nearly severed entirely. "You feel something," Nathan observed one evening, watching Damien stare northward into the darkness with an intensity that suggested his mind was entirely elsewhere. "The bond. It is never fully broken," Damien admitted quietly. "Even during the months I believed the worst of her, even during the trial itself, something remained. I told myself it was simply grief, or the lingering habit of a connection I had grown accustomed to. But now I wonder if some part of me always knew the truth, even when I refused to listen to it." They continued north for another 2 weeks, questioning villagers and travelers along the way, gathering fragments of rumors that gradually began to coalesce into something more substantial. A trader mentioned a valley hidden somewhere in the mountains ahead, accessible only by a narrow trail, marked with symbols, meant to guide those who already knew what to look for. A hunter spoke of strange lights, sometimes visible on distant mountainsides at night, lights that appeared and vanished, as though deliberately concealed from casual observation. Finally, on a cold morning nearly 2 months after leaving Ashwood Castle, Damien's group came across a narrow trail winding up into rocky terrain, marked with small carved symbols on the trees that matched the descriptions they had gathered along their journey. Damien felt something shift powerfully within his chest as he studied the markings, a certainty settling over him that this, finally, was the path that would lead him to Elena. "We proceed carefully," he instructed his warriors. "No weapons drawn, no aggressive posturing. If this is truly a sanctuary for those seeking refuge, the last thing we want is to appear as a threat." They followed the trail higher into the mountains, and as they climbed, Damien began to sense something unmistakable through the mate bond, a warmth and clarity that had been entirely absent during the long months of searching. Elena was near. He was certain of it now, certain in a way that transcended logic or evidence, certain in the deep, instinctive way that only the mate bond could provide. But as they crested a ridge that overlooked a hidden valley below, smoke rising peacefully from a cluster of wooden buildings nestled against the mountainside, a different kind of alarm cut through Damien's growing hope. Movement on the far side of the valley caught his attention, figures moving with the deliberate, coordinated stealth of warriors preparing for an assault, and even from this distance, Damien recognized the markings on their clothing. Blackthorn scouts, dozens of them, positioned along the ridgeline opposite the sanctuary, clearly preparing to move against the settlement below. "They have found it too," Nathan said grimly, following Damien's gaze toward the gathering forces. "Whether they know Elena is here, or simply seek an easy target in an undefended settlement, it makes no difference. They intend to attack." Damien's blood ran cold at the realization. Somewhere in that valley below, Elena was living, possibly with children he had never met, entirely unaware that a Blackthorn force was preparing to descend upon the peaceful sanctuary that had sheltered her for nearly a year. He had traveled hundreds of miles, driven by desperate hope and the fragile thread of a bond he had nearly destroyed, only to arrive at the precise moment when everything Elena had built for herself and her children stood on the edge of complete destruction. "We move now," Damien said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for hesitation among his warriors. "Whatever grievances exist between Ashwood and Blackthorn, whatever history stands between us, none of it matters in this moment. There are innocent people in that valley, and I will not stand by and watch them destroyed while I have the power to prevent it." His small group of warriors, though vastly outnumbered by the assembled Blackthorn forces, moved swiftly down the mountainside, using the terrain to their advantage, as they had trained to do throughout years of border conflicts. Damien led from the front, his mind consumed by a single overwhelming purpose that eclipsed every other consideration: the need to reach Elena, to protect her, and whatever family she had built, before the gathering storm below could claim them. As they descended, the first sounds of conflict began to echo up from the valley floor, shouts of alarm from the sanctuary's lookouts, the distant clash of the Blackthorn forces beginning their assault against a settlement that, until this moment, had remained hidden and safe for nearly a year. Damien pushed his warriors faster, every instinct screaming at him to reach the valley before it was too late, before the sanctuary that had sheltered Elena through the darkest months of her life became the site of a tragedy he would never be able to forgive himself for failing to prevent. Elena had been tending the garden with Thomas and Rosalind, now nearly 6 months old and growing stronger every day, when Oliver Finch's warning call echoed across the valley, sharp and urgent, cutting through the peaceful morning air. She scooped both children into her arms instantly, her heart racing as she recognized the particular tone of the alarm, one reserved only for genuine, immediate danger. "Blackthorn scouts, moving down from the northern ridge," Margaret said, appearing at Elena's side with remarkable speed for a woman of her years, her expression grim but composed. "More than we can hope to hold off with our usual defenses. We need to move the children and the vulnerable to the lower caves immediately." The sanctuary, though hidden for years, had never been designed to withstand a coordinated assault from a trained force, and Elena understood immediately the gravity of the situation. She held Thomas and Rosalind close as Margaret guided her toward the network of caves beneath the settlement, caves that had been prepared years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency, though never yet tested against a genuine threat. But as they moved through the chaos of the sanctuary, warriors and residents scrambling to defend the settlement or flee toward safety, Elena felt something stir within her that she had not experienced since before her banishment, a fierce protective instinct that refused to simply retreat and hide while others fought to defend her and her children. "Take them," she said suddenly, pressing Thomas and Rosalind into Margaret's arms. "Get them to the caves. I need to help defend this place. These people took me in when I had nowhere else to go, and I will not hide while they fight to protect us." Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding, understanding the fierce determination in Elena's eyes, and recognizing that arguing would only waste precious time. "Be careful," she said, already moving toward the cave entrance, with the twins secured protectively against her. "Your children need their mother to return to them." Elena turned toward the sound of approaching conflict, her hunting knife drawn, every instinct honed through years of training, before her banishment rising to the surface as she moved to join the sanctuary's defenders along the eastern approach to the settlement. The Blackthorn scouts, though a disciplined force, had clearly not anticipated the fierce resistance the small sanctuary community was capable of mounting, and the initial clash proved fiercer than either side had expected. Elena fought alongside Oliver and several other warriors, holding a defensive line near the settlement's main buildings, her movements sharp and precise, despite the months that had passed since she had last engaged in genuine combat. But the Blackthorn force was larger and better equipped, and slowly, steadily, the sanctuary's defenders found themselves pushed backward, their line beginning to fracture under the sustained pressure. It was in the midst of this desperate struggle that Damien and his warriors arrived, descending the mountainside with a speed and ferocity that caught the Blackthorn forces entirely by surprise. Damien moved through the chaos with singular purpose, cutting a path toward the heart of the conflict, his warriors following close behind, their sudden arrival shifting the balance of the battle almost immediately. Elena, caught in the fierce exchange near the settlement's center, barely registered the change in the tide of battle until a familiar presence crashed into her awareness through the mate bond, so strong and unmistakable that she nearly lost her footing entirely. She turned, and across the chaos of the clearing, through warriors and scouts locked in desperate struggle, she saw him. Damien. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a suspended moment, the chaos of the battle seemed to fade into background noise, both of them frozen by the impossible reality of the other's presence. But the moment could not last, not with the fighting still raging around them, and Damien moved toward her with fierce determination, cutting down every obstacle between them, with a focus that left no doubt about his singular purpose. "Elena," he called out, as he closed the distance, his voice carrying every ounce of the desperate hope and guilt he had carried across hundreds of miles of searching. Behind you, Elena shouted, her training overriding the overwhelming emotion of the moment, as she spotted a Blackthorn scout moving to attack Damien from an angle he could not see. Damien turned just in time, meeting the attack and disabling his opponent with practiced efficiency, before turning back toward Elena, closing the final distance between them. "You are alive," he said, his voice breaking with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I searched for months. I did not know if I would ever find you. And now I find you here, defending a settlement against an attack I arrived just in time to help repel." "There is no time for this now," Elena said, though her own voice trembled with the overwhelming complexity of emotions crashing through her. Relief and anger, and love and betrayal, all tangled together in a way she could not begin to untangle in the midst of ongoing conflict. "We need to end this fight first." Together, they turned back toward the battle, fighting side by side, for the first time since her banishment, their movements falling into an instinctive rhythm that months of separation had not erased. With Damien's warriors reinforcing the sanctuary's defenders, the tide of the battle shifted decisively, and within the hour, the surviving Blackthorn scouts began a hasty retreat, recognizing that their intended target had transformed from an easy, undefended settlement into a force capable of repelling their assault entirely. As the last of the conflict faded, and the sanctuary's defenders began the exhausted work of tending to the wounded and assessing the damage, Elena finally allowed herself to face Damien directly, the adrenaline of battle giving way to the enormous weight of everything that remained unspoken between them. "How did you find me?" she asked quietly. "The mate bond," Damien said. "It never fully broke, even during the worst of it. And Elena, I know the truth now. I know you were innocent. Edgar and Lyra orchestrated everything, the false evidence, even the raid itself. I have already brought them to justice before the council, but it means nothing, nothing at all, if I cannot make things right with you." Elena studied his face for a long moment, seeing the genuine anguish and remorse written clearly across his features. But the months of pain and exile could not be erased in a single moment, however sincere his words might be. "You banished me based on lies, Damien, without giving me the chance to truly defend myself. You chose grief and fear over the bond we shared." "I know," Damien said, his voice raw with the weight of his own guilt. "And I will spend however long it takes proving that I understand the depth of that failure. But Elena, there is something else you should know. Something I have felt through the bond during my search. Something I do not fully understand." Before Elena could respond, Margaret emerged from the cave entrance, carrying Thomas and Rosalind carefully in her arms, both children now awake and alert, after the chaos of the battle had finally subsided. Damien's eyes moved to the children instantly, and Elena watched, her heart pounding, as understanding began to dawn across his face. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are they?" "Yours," Elena confirmed, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion churning within her. "Thomas and Rosalind, born nearly 6 months ago, 3 weeks after I discovered I was carrying them, alone in the wilderness, after you banished me from everything I had ever known." Damien moved toward Margaret slowly, almost disbelieving, and as he looked down at his children for the first time, seeing Thomas's dark hair and Rosalind's watchful, curious eyes, something within him broke and rebuilt itself simultaneously, grief and guilt transforming into a fierce and overwhelming love for 2 small lives he had not even known existed until this very moment. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion, as he looked between Elena and his children. "For everything. I do not deserve forgiveness, but I am asking for the chance to earn it, however long that may take." Elena watched him carefully, watched the genuine devastation and love written across his features as he gazed upon his children for the first time, and felt something within her own guarded heart begin, cautiously, to soften. The days that followed the battle, the sanctuary settled into a careful period of recovery, tending to the wounded and rebuilding what had been damaged during the assault. Damien remained in the valley, his warriors assisting with repairs and reinforcing the settlement's defenses against any future threats, while he and Elena navigated the delicate, complicated process of rebuilding something between them that had been shattered nearly a year earlier. He spent his days learning who his children had become in the months he had missed, watching Thomas's fearless curiosity lead him crawling toward every interesting object within reach, and observing Rosalind's quiet, watchful nature as she studied him with the same careful attention she seemed to give everything around her. Margaret remarked more than once that the girl seemed to be evaluating her father, weighing his presence with an awareness far beyond what one would expect from an infant. "She takes after her mother," Damien said one evening, sitting beside Elena near the small fire outside the cottage that had become her home over the past year. "Careful, watchful, slow to trust, but steady once trust is given." Elena allowed herself a small smile at the observation, though the wariness that had settled into her heart since the trial had not entirely faded. "And Thomas takes after neither of us particularly," she said. "He seems entirely his own person already, fearless in ways that terrify me." They fell into comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire, both aware that beneath the surface, calm, difficult conversations still remained unresolved between them. Finally, Damien spoke, his voice careful and deliberate. "I do not expect you to simply forgive what happened," he said. "I do not expect you to return to Ashwood as though nothing occurred, as though the past year did not happen exactly as it did. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, whether you choose to return with me or remain here, I will support your choice and continue proving myself worthy of your trust for as long as it takes." Elena considered his words carefully, weighing the genuine sincerity she heard in his voice against the deep, lingering pain of everything she had endured. "I have built a life here," she said finally. "A hard life, but an honest one, surrounded by people who took me in without question and helped me raise our children in safety. That is not something I can simply walk away from without careful thought." "I understand," Damien said. "And I would never ask you to abandon the people who protected you and our children when I failed to do so myself." Over the following weeks, as the sanctuary continued its recovery, Damien proved his sincerity through consistent, patient action, rather than empty words. He worked alongside the sanctuary's residents, helping rebuild damaged structures, tending to the wounded, and earning, slowly, the cautious trust of a community that had every reason to view an Alpha King with suspicion. He spent every possible moment with Thomas and Rosalind, learning the rhythms of caring for infants with a dedication that surprised even himself, and he never pushed Elena toward a decision she was not ready to make. Margaret, watching this careful courtship unfold over the following month, found herself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of genuine reconciliation, though she remained protective of Elena and quick to voice concern whenever she sensed pressure being applied too forcefully. "He seems different than the stories I heard when you first arrived here," Margaret observed one afternoon, watching Damien patiently teach Thomas to take his first wobbling steps in the garden, while Rosalind observed from Elena's arms with characteristic careful attention. "People can change," Elena said, though her voice carried a complexity of emotion that suggested she was still working through exactly what that change meant for her own heart, or perhaps the truth simply revealed who he was capable of becoming, once fear and grief no longer clouded his judgment. As spring gave way to early summer, and the sanctuary valley bloomed with wildflowers along the mountainside, Elena found herself, slowly and cautiously, allowing the walls she had built around her heart to soften. It was not a sudden reconciliation, not a moment of dramatic forgiveness, but rather a gradual rebuilding, day by day, conversation by conversation, as Damien demonstrated through consistent action that he understood the depth of his failure and was committed to earning back what he had lost. One evening, as they sat together watching Thomas and Rosalind play together in the grass outside their cottage, both children now confidently mobile and endlessly curious about the world around them, Damien turned to Elena with a question he had been carefully considering for weeks. "The council knows the truth now," he said. "Edgar and Lyra have been banished, their treachery exposed publicly. Ashwood needs its beta returned, needs its rightful queen to take her place, if you are willing. But I am not asking you to return for the sake of the throne, or the pack, or even for our children's sake alone. I am asking because I love you, Elena, as completely and honestly as I ever have, and I want the chance to build a life with you that honors the trust you once placed in me, before I broke it so completely." Elena watched their children playing together in the golden evening light, watched the earnest hope written across Damien's face as he waited for her answer, and felt the final remaining walls around her heart begin, gently, to give way. "I will return," she said finally, "not because the wound has fully healed, because I do not believe wounds like this ever fully disappear, but because I believe you have genuinely changed, and because our children deserve to grow up knowing both their parents, in a home built on truth rather than fear. But Damien, if I return, it will be as your equal, not simply as your mate restored to her previous position. I will not stand silently again while decisions are made that affect my life and the lives of our children without my voice being fully heard. Agreed, Damien said immediately, relief and joy washing across his features in equal measure. Completely and without reservation, Elena. You will have every voice, every authority that is rightfully yours, both as my mate and as a leader in your own right. Margaret, watching this exchange from a respectful distance, felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her, knowing that the woman who had arrived at the sanctuary a year earlier, frightened and alone, was finally preparing to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her, this time on her own terms rather than terms dictated by others. The journey back to Ashwood territory took nearly 2 weeks, a slower pace than Damien's initial search north had required, but one that allowed Thomas and Rosalind to travel comfortably and gave Elena time to prepare herself emotionally for the return to a place that held both her happiest memories and her deepest wounds. Margaret and several members of the sanctuary community traveled with them, unwilling to let Elena face the transition entirely alone, and Damien welcomed their presence warmly, understanding the debt of gratitude he owed to the people who had protected his family when he had failed to do so himself. Word of their approach had traveled ahead of them. Carried by messengers Damien sent forward to prepare the pack for what was coming, and as their group finally crossed into Ashwood territory, Elena felt the strange, disorienting sensation of returning to a place she had once believed she would never see again. The mountains looked the same as she remembered, the familiar paths and landmarks triggering memories both comforting and painful in equal measure. The great hall of Ashwood Castle had been prepared for their arrival, and as Elena walked through its doors once more, this time not in silver chains but at Damien's side, carrying Rosalind while Damien carried Thomas, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, the same eyes that had watched her banishment nearly a year and a half earlier now witnessing her return. Damien led her to the platform where her trial had taken place, the same stone dais where he had once pronounced her banishment, and turned to address the assembled pack with a voice that carried both authority and genuine emotion. Nearly a year and a half ago, he began, I stood in this hall and banished an innocent woman, based on lies constructed by those I trusted most completely. Elena Voss did not betray this pack. She was betrayed by it, by advisors who valued ambition over truth, by a king who allowed grief and fear to override the trust that should have guided his judgment. The hall remained silent, every member of the pack listening intently, as Damien continued, laying out the full truth of Edgar and Lyra's betrayal, the false evidence, the orchestrated raid, and the terrible consequences that had followed from a rushed and unjust judgment. During her exile, Damien continued, Elena gave birth to our children, Thomas and Rosalind, heirs to this throne, who spent the first months of their lives hidden away, because their own father failed to protect their mother from the lies of those who sought power for themselves. He turned to Elena, taking her hand and drawing her forward to stand beside him at the center of the platform, their children held between them, and the symbolism of the moment was not lost on anyone gathered in the hall. I am formally reinstating Elena Voss as beta of this pack, Damien announced, his voice ringing with conviction. And further, I am naming her Alpha Queen, an equal partner in leadership, in recognition of the profound injustice done to her, and in recognition of her strength, wisdom, and unwavering integrity throughout everything she has endured. A wave of emotion moved through the gathered crowd, and slowly, beginning with Nathan Cole and spreading outward through the hall, the pack members began to kneel in acknowledgement of their returned and newly elevated queen, a gesture of respect and apology that Elena felt deeply, though the formal ceremony could never fully erase the pain of what she had lost during her exile. In the weeks that followed, Ashwood Pack began the slow process of rebuilding trust and stability under its restored leadership. Damien worked closely with Elena to reform the council structures that had allowed Edgar's manipulation to succeed so thoroughly, implementing new safeguards to ensure that future accusations would require more rigorous verification before any judgment could be rendered. Elena, for her part, threw herself into her restored role with the same determination and integrity that had defined her leadership before her banishment, earning back the trust of a pack that had watched her be wrongly cast out, and now watched her rightfully return. Thomas and Rosalind grew quickly within the walls of Ashwood Castle, surrounded by a community that had come to understand and appreciate the depth of their mother's strength and their father's genuine remorse. Margaret remained at the castle for several months, helping the twins adjust to their new home before eventually returning to the sanctuary, though Elena made certain that the Hidden Valley community would forever remain under Ashwood's protection, a debt of gratitude that could never be fully repaid but would always be honored. As for Edgar and Lyra, their banishment proved permanent, their names becoming a quiet warning within Ashwood's history about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the terrible cost of choosing power over loyalty and truth. Neither was heard from again within Ashwood territory, and the council, forever changed by the lessons of that painful chapter, remained vigilant against any similar betrayal in the years that followed. On a warm evening nearly a year after their return, Damien and Elena stood together on the balcony, overlooking the Ashwood Valley, watching Thomas and Rosalind play in the garden below under the watchful eyes of several pack guardians. The scars of what they had endured remained, quiet and permanent reminders of a year that had tested them both, beyond anything either had imagined possible. But the love between them, tempered and strengthened rather than destroyed by the trials they had faced, burned steadier than ever. "Do you regret any of it?" Damien asked quietly, watching their children's laughter drift up from the garden below. "If you could have avoided the exile, the fear, everything you endured, would you choose a different path?" Elena considered the question carefully, thinking of the sanctuary that had sheltered her, of Margaret's steady kindness, of the fierce independence and strength she had discovered within herself during the darkest months of her exile. "I would not choose to relive the pain," she said finally, "but I would not undo the journey either. It made me who I am now, and it taught our children, even in ways they cannot yet understand, that strength and integrity matter more than titles or thrones." Damien pulled her close, resting his chin gently against her hair, as they watched their children play together in the fading evening light. "Then I will spend the rest of my life making certain that strength and integrity remain the foundation of everything we build together," he said. "For you, for Thomas and Rosalind, and for every generation of this pack that follows after us." Below them, Thomas's laughter rang out clear and joyful across the garden, while Rosalind, ever watchful, glanced up toward the balcony where her parents stood together, as though even now, still so young, she understood the significance of the peace they had finally found. The Alpha King, who had once banished his mate as a traitor, now stood beside her as an equal, their twin heirs playing safely in the golden light of a kingdom finally at peace, built not on the silence of unquestioned power, but on the hard-won foundation of truth, trust, and a love strong enough to survive even the deepest betrayal.